Thanks, Savannah. Thanks to all of you for coming and those of you joining us on the magical World Wide Web. I have a question for you before we begin our discussion. And that is, how many of you have ever written a book? Okay, a couple of people. How many of you are in the process of or dreaming of writing a book someday? Yeah, I'm in that latter category. The distant part, the dreaming of writing a book someday. You know, for the last 30 years, I've been interviewing people on a variety of issues. For 20 years, I did a program on C-SPAN called Close Up on C-SPAN. And my best guesstimate, without actually doing the math, is that about 25% of the people that I've interviewed over the years and the people I still interview here in the Wilson Center are in that category. They either are authors or they are aspiring authors. And so over the years, I've become really interested in the process, and often in search of some shortcut to write my book, which doesn't exist. I can assure you after all these years of interviews that there is no shortcut. So I thought before we dive into the notion of can we price carbon, I want to ask you, Barry, first to talk to us a bit about the story behind the story. The idea for the book, when did it occur to you, and what was your motivation for writing it?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, John, for being here. Savannah, other folks affiliated with the Wilson Center. I had a wonderful experience here as a fellow. It actually changed and influenced the direction of this book, expanded to become much more international than I had originally intended. And so it's just really great fun for me to be back. And so thank you for that. I think there's a growing question in the policy world. What is the role of a book versus academic scholarly articles in journals that might be held back from the public by a paywall versus blogs versus op-eds and the whole package? And I work not in the Department of Political Science, but in a multidisciplinary program, a school of public policy, where the largest single discipline is the discipline of economics, where books are rarely written. Most of my economics colleagues have never written a book. They focus exclusively on journals. In my case, as a political scientist, I'm in sort of a mixed discipline and put those two packages together. And I tend to only think about books when not only do I feel like there's a longer story to unpack or more to explore, but I really need to be able to step back and take some time and go much, much more deeply into an issue. And so I've tended to hold those back till moments where I had something like a sabbatical or a fellowship and could really develop that. I also thought in this case, this idea of carbon and carbon pricing is not new. It's been around a long time, kicking around in academic circles in the United States and Canada and beyond, whether one thinks about cap and trade or a carbon tax. The case has been made extensively, exhaustively, in multiple forms, largely from the discipline of economics. My thought here was to really give a book-length treatment and ask what happens when you take an idea, a great idea from a great discipline like an economics, and put that into the real world of policy, especially over a period of 15 or 20 years. Is it possible to take this great idea and operationalize it or not, especially because so much of the literature to this point has been written from the standpoint, as I discussed with my colleagues in economics, from the sense of how we would decide policy in a world that didn't have politics, or that politics could be pushed aside and institutions could be pushed aside because of the power of the idea. And so I really wanted to come at that from the political question, and I really felt, and the authors can ultimately be the judge of it, that that required something more than a short journal article, and to unpack that to some extent through a book.
And speaking of paywalls, the book is available for purchase outside this room, and Barry will stick around afterwards to do some signing. So, you know, there are paywalls of different kinds. So there's the low-tech, not virtual paywall. But, you know, it costs money to do this, so that's an understandable fee. Also, I wanted to tell those of you joining us on the webcast, to give you some time in advance, that we will be taking your questions as well as the questions of the people in the room. So at any moment, if you want to tweet to us at Canada Institute, one word, at Canada Institute on Twitter, tweet us a question, and we will sort through them and try to get some of them to Barry before the end of our hour together. For those of you in the room, you can actually just ask them like real people. You won't have to tweet them at us or anything like that. You mentioned the various iterations or versions of a type of carbon tax or carbon price. Could you provide us with your definitions up front? What is the distinction you're making between carbon pricing, carbon taxes, probably the most talked about in political circles, cap and trade.
Sure. I try to look at all of these to some degree in the book, especially how they played out in real political and governmental time. I think the unifying theme behind all of these, as I understand it, is to try to apply a price to the use of fossil fuels, which in most governmental circles is legal to produce and certainly legal to use. But adding to that price by some link to a tax or a pricing mechanism that increase that cost, linked in some way to an estimate of what the environmental damage would be. In this case, carbon or some measure of carbon emissions. That can take indeed the form of a tax, which is a relatively straightforward instrument, perhaps building on existing taxes, so-called excise taxes for gasoline, or something that truly cuts across all fossil fuels, but uses the direct cost imposition of a tax mechanism on the use of those fossil fuels. And there are cases and examples of that that we can talk about. The pricing mechanism of cap and trade, as you mentioned, is a little different. It imposes an overall cap on emissions, but rather than using the blunt instrument of rules or regulations or performance standards that mandates standard use of a particular abatement technology or one standard metric that every producing source of an emission has to comply with, it allows for some degree of flexibility within that cap. And then when you go to the extent of not just allocating these allowances, emission allowances, if you will, for free, but auctioning them, they can indeed produce revenue, as we're beginning to see in some of these experiments. And so in that case as well, there is an additional cost, but there is some flexibility and some negotiating room in terms of what that will be. Carbon tax, by my definition, does not set a cap on the total amount of emissions. The actual emission reduction links in part to what happens when you put that tax into place. The cap sets that emission cap at a firm level and then allows marketplaces to work. That, though, both of those are really quite different than other tools and instruments, which I think from an economics perspective are a lot less attractive, but as I argue in the book, from a political perspective, might be substantially more attractive, that uses some kind of a rule or a performance standard or some kind of mechanism along those lines, or other kinds of incentive systems. The unifying concept here is to allow the marketplace to work to some extent, and then react to those higher prices in whatever way the market chooses to do so.
And I don't want to ignore the why do any of this question. This is to address essentially climate change, correct?
That's right. That's right. Clearly, when we say climate change, clearly when we say fossil fuels, we are talking about impacts that go beyond carbon emissions and climate change. But the real driving force here is how does one best to engage in some kind of decarbonization of society to potentially mitigate or reduce the threats from climate change. Again, the issue of climate change is not new. The ideas here of these policy ideas is not new. But how do we best reduce those risks, both in the short and the longer term, with the tool that, again, from the economics perspective, is clearly the grand champion or the best way to go.
Well, one of the people in the room with us, Steve Lagerfeld. Steve, and we didn't discuss this in advance, so I hope this doesn't embarrass you. But when Steve was, and see if I want to see if you remember this as well. I don't know, you won't, okay, but at least we'll give it a try. When Steve was the editor of our award-winning Wilson Quarterly, he hosted some events here for subscribers to the Quarterly. Do you remember one you did several years ago with Tom Friedman? Does that ring a bell?
I don't think that was me.
Really?
But he was here.
I'm using you as an example, or okay, but anyway, so this might not be relevant, but I still will bring up the Tom Friedman comment because I think it's relevant to a lot of the things you've written in the book or the things you've explored. One of the questions, Friedman was using the term Washington is dysfunctional over and over and over again. And most people in the audience were just smiling and nodding their agreement without any exploration of what he meant by that. Finally, someone in the audience stood up and said, "What do you mean by that? I hear that all the time. What does that mean?" And he said, good question. He admitted to being sort of on autopilot. But then he said, well, an example would be most economists or scientists or people that you speak to around the world say that a good idea that would work would be essentially carbon pricing. I think he said specifically a gas tax at the time. And he said, but his example of why Washington is dysfunctional is we're at a point where we can't even discuss the idea because it's politically radioactive. And I want to hear if you have the same association I had in reading the book with this idea and how it relates to the viability of carbon pricing. Politically, is this radioactive?
I'm not sure I would say it's radioactive, but it certainly does cause a lot of anxiety when you move it into a pretty wide range of political circles, especially if those conversations are public. I've really been struck just beginning to look at the economics community. How many economists over the last 30 years who have served in prominent roles in American governments, Republican and Democratic administrations, who have written about, talked about, endorsed the idea of some kind of a carbon price. And yet, by my read of the content analysis, most of the thrust of those arguments have come before they took high positions in government or after they've left. Something happens during that administration that makes it harder to engage in that very specific conversation when you're running the Council of Economic Advisors or you're a chief advisor to the president. And you know, in the wide range of issues that I've studied over the course of my career, which I don't mean to dwell on now, but cover a wide range of environmental and energy issues, it's striking to me how there's often a kind of two-level game or a two-level set of conversations that one has when we're dealing with people in the political realm. One is a view of what a carbon price might look like when the doors close and the cameras are off, and how a lot of politicians who might never be expected to say much about the issue shift their position at the federal level in Washington, at the state level, outside the U.S., but then when they have to play the public game, perhaps it does become more radioactive and more problematic. And so that, I think, is a big part of the challenge, certainly in the U.S. as in the Friedman case, but not exclusive to the United States. We've been at this a long time, and a lot of governments have had an opportunity to really take a serious crack at it, and I think the results have been pretty mixed.
Tell us the story of how tobacco factors into your thinking about this, and there's a personal angle to this involving your father.
There is. I am the son of a cigar salesman. The first professional writing I did was when my dad used to give me, in my teenage years, money to write letters to state legislators and federal legislators telling them that the proposed increases in excise taxes for tobacco was a policy abomination. It would affect his livelihood. It would push people out of work. And it is interesting then, beyond my own personal experience, to think about parallels with tobacco, because the tobacco, oil, gas, and coal issues have been joined for really quite some time. Addiction as a framing reference. The fact that the initial way to deal with some of these issues in the U.S. and beyond have been some kind of an excise tax on, say, gasoline or tobacco. Concerns about how politically one could achieve a substantial reduction in tobacco use and how one would go about that, especially given the wide range in the U.S. of congressional districts and states that either produce, or as in my father's case, distribute or refine that product. A lot of discussion across these comparisons, and it is interesting to note that during my college years, over 40% of Americans smoked. Now the latest numbers are about 14 or 15%. There are many reasons to explain this huge transformation in tobacco use in the United States. The expansion of and outreach of science, regulatory provisions. I don't know what the Wilson Center smoking policy was in the 1970s, but it's certainly restricted now. And yet again, by almost all the analyses that have been done of this transformation, which some argue is one of the great public health achievements of the last 25 years. The driving force there were tobacco excise tax increases. Tobacco taxes at the federal level over 300% higher than they were in the 1970s. If you look at the mean state cigarette tax, including states like Virginia, South Carolina, major tobacco producing states, average state taxes are up over 320% from where they were in the early 1970s. That has been a sustained pattern in Republican and Democratic-led states and at the federal level, continually ratcheting up that tax for a bunch of reasons, but the biggest single driver being setting that price high enough to drive down consumption, and then with it, thinking about ways that you might use that revenue. So the idea of comparing that to oil, gas, and coal has been in the public arena for a long period of time. But then if you look at that proxy measure of what has happened with gasoline excise taxes, where the cigarette taxes have just gone through the roof. Tobacco taxes have gone through the roof. Gasoline taxes have changed just mildly during that same 30 or 40-year period of time, possibly then weakening the ability to make that comparison. But throughout the book, I've looked for analogies, comparisons, and asking, is the whole carbon pricing phenomena just a unique, idiosyncratic fluke, or are there parallels, or are there analogies that can help us explain them, beginning with the issue, John, as you mentioned, of tobacco?
Another example, Barry, that you talk about is at your university, University of Michigan, an attempt to essentially create your own contained version of this. What happened?
Sure. In the months before I came to the Wilson Center to begin working on this book, it is interesting to think of universities and colleges. I would argue, certainly in the United States, if there is a place where there's not a lot of resistance to the scientific arguments on climate change, they are modern universities and colleges. Colleges have spent, and universities like mine have spent a small fortune expanding courses, faculties, laboratories, research programs to expressly deal with the climate change issue. That's certainly been true of the University of Michigan for decades, throughout the entire time that I've been a member of the faculty. One would also then expect, and we are seeing many ways in which colleges and universities are trying to reduce their carbon footprint. And it's interesting to think about this. In the case of the University of Michigan, we have about 45,000 students, a large medical and hospital system. We're about half the size of a large city, or medium-sized, I should say, city. And so we've set greenhouse gas reduction targets for a good long time in Ann Arbor. And in the months before I came to the Wilson Center, I was asked to serve on a review committee of faculty, students, and staff, and begin by looking at where we were at in terms of our targets, our emission reduction targets for 2025. This was a fascinating process because you got into laboratories, specialized units, natural gas turbines, the whole package. And one thing we were really good at universities is producing data. We have good measures of our energy use. After a while, then we began to turn to the issue of what to do about this, whether we were making our targets or not, and what might steps be. And this was a really fascinating process. Imagine all the ways on the campus of a great university where there's deep concern about the climate issue. You might think about decarbonization. What about changing the boiler in the central campus power plant? What about putting up more solar arrays all around campus? What about buying offsets from forests through reforestation efforts? What about going from LEED gold status to LEED platinum status on all future university construction? On and on and on it went. In the back of my mind, I kept thinking, well, no one has really talked about the idea of a price. And I'd love to see what my former students can do with ideas when they leave the classroom. And sure enough, had a former student who was a recent graduate of the College of Engineering who said, well, wait a second. There is this idea of a carbon price. Explain the tax, cap and trade. And then said, we could do that at the University of Michigan. We could be the first, at this point, research university to seriously consider this idea. And then he looked at me and smiled and he said, just like we talked about in Professor Rabe's class. This then led to the pause. Why not adopt a carbon price, in this case, at the University of Michigan? And for a short time, I thought we were really on a roll. Yeah, you could do it. You measure it. Think about ways you might measure it, and then even look at a trading system and have competitions, much as we do for recycling. Then what might you do with the revenue? Much as the University of Texas system, having set aside trust lands in the 1860s, does with the royalties from oil and gas. What might we do with that revenue? And then it pivoted. For faculty in the natural and physical sciences, would a carbon price be discriminatory and favor the humanities and the social sciences? After all, the natural and physical sciences have larger offices, larger labs. These labs are more carbon intensive. Does that mean we have to cross-subsidize the humanities and the social sciences, where the faculty tend to work in small offices and teaching involves large lecture in a single room? Objections further continued. What about travel? Will this put further restrictions on our ability to get on a plane and go to conferences where we need to engage our research? What about grants? Would there be an added carbon price on our grant outreach efforts when we make a proposal for funding, federal funding? Will that make us less competitive with our peers unless they take comparable steps? And then we had looked at areas around our campus where there were real spikes in greenhouse gases, spikes in carbon use. The athletic department, our iconic stadiums, football stadium, and scoreboards. The hospital system. How might you go to more specialized units that provide a public service and good, whether that's football on a Saturday or healthcare 24/7, and ask them then to consider paying an extra price? And before you know it, the tenure changed. And ultimately what emerged is there's still been no resolution on this to my knowledge. This was not part of the final package. And so our university, like most colleges, like most universities that pursue sustainability plans, in essence offers almost every strategy imaginable except some kind of direct form of carbon price. And so with that, I came here and decided to write a book and ask if the University of Michigan was anything different than the federal government of the United States or Canada or other places around the world.
Well, one way it may be different is that you had an audience that was pretty much in agreement that this was worth doing, where it might not be the case in a state or a province or another country where there may be more political opposition or less interest among the citizenry. What that seems to describe that even in a place where it wasn't as heavy a lift, you ran into all these barriers and complications.
That's right. Obviously, as you move beyond the bubble of the University of Michigan, you have even a more difficult lift in many respects because there are then these disagreements. I've been part of a project now for about a decade looking at public opinion views in the United States, but also increasingly in Canada, on a range of climate issues. And we find that there is a subset of Americans, even when you begin with the question, do you think that there is solid evidence that global temperatures have warmed over the last 4 decades before we get to human causation? And you peel away about 15% of Americans who say, no, there is no solid evidence that temperatures have warmed over the last 40 years, 10 to 15% unsure. And then when you transition to human causation, that begins to shift even further. Now, at one level, there is inevitably American tension and debate over science in the tobacco area. Most Gallup poll surveys show that about 10% of Americans to this day, almost a half century after the Surgeon General's reports that really led to this major, major change and adoption of new policies, about 10% of Americans say there is no solid scientific evidence that smoking tobacco causes cancer or other health issues. I'm not saying that the scientific measures here are identical or the causation issues are identical, but interesting to think about other areas where we kind of lack a consensus, or then if you're going to try to achieve a political consensus on something like a carbon price, where there is that level of lack of consensus, controversy, and even fluctuation, that probably elevates the lift substantially.
You know what I want to do right now is ask those of you who have questions to tee them up. You had your hand up? We can go straight to them right now then. I was going to ask another question to buy you time, but I don't want to do that thing where we wait till the last 5 minutes and ask for your questions and squeeze in one. So there is a microphone. Since we are webcasting, you will need a microphone to ask your question, and this gentleman will help you get one of those. It should be on, but just in case it's not. The gentleman at the end of the table right there in the blue shirt. And it's always useful if you identify yourself. Let Barry know who he's speaking with.
Hi, Barry. This is Jesse Worker. I'm at the World Resource Institute, but actually was a graduate of the Ford School back 10 years ago or so. I think I'll actually start there. I remember 10 years ago, we had a little debate. You may have moderated, and this was in 2008. So there were the prospects of U.S. federal climate action. You know, those were heady days, right? And there was a debate, I think, between policy economists on campus, policy experts on campus, between cap and trade and carbon tax. And I think one of the arguments made at that point for the cap and trade, there was, I think, generally an agreement that a tax was a simpler economic instrument, issues around how you issue permits and so forth under cap and trade, were there more possibilities for gaming it, that's arguable. But now, 10 years later, a failure of cap and trade policy in the U.S., And it almost seems like an idea that hasn't really been, that has less political viability now. And the carbon tax, we've seen at least efforts at this, we're seeing more action at the state level. Well, I'm not sure. I'd like to know what you think in terms of how you see. I think cap and trade has a bad connotation amongst coalitions, at least of sort of grassroots coalitions. It's seen as an instrument that can be gamed easier, whereas carbon tax, how you distribute the revenues can, there's how you invest those and make those something that addresses sustainable development generally. How do you see that politically over the course of your research? Thanks.
Sure. It was about a decade ago. It's good to see you again, Jesse. I think that there is this interesting debate, isn't there? Carbon tax versus cap and trade. And in raw political terms, I think this further splits coalitions. We've seen alignments and realignments that don't bring different carbon pricing constituencies together, but that can fragment them. In some cases, that's once you've accepted a tool, then you have to think about how you're going to allocate the revenue and who gets it, which I think is an important consideration. But I think that this tension between two alternative vehicles, if you will, for a carbon price, a tax or trading, has really further complicated matters in political terms. I think you're quite right. The conversations that I remember that you're talking about a decade ago really assumed that cap and trade was ascendant, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I don't try in the book to sort of settle the score and pick one over the other. But in political terms, cap and trade was really riding quite high. There had been many, many proposals for this in versions of the U.S. Senate leading up to 2008 and that election. There was the remarkable and often told story of the U.S. sulfur dioxide case, which many routinely were arguing could be relatively easy to apply to the carbon case, although one can quibble with the applicability of that fit. Then, in some respects, you had the brutal debates in Congress and nationally in 2009 and 2010 at a very point that there was this strong increase in the number of people who said they didn't find strong evidence of climate change at all, kind of wove in together. And then beyond that, you had the experiences from Europe, the emissions trading scheme. The US didn't do this, but the Europeans did. In some ways ironic, because the earlier vehicle that had driven carbon pricing in Europe was not cap and trade, but the 5 Scanda countries in the early 1990s that adopted their own taxes and were able to sustain them and have held on to them to some extent to this day. So the European issues are interesting, and I spend quite a bit of time in the book looking at this and asking why, in a case where there seems to be such broad buy-in early on to the idea of cap and trade or a carbon price there, has that proven so hard to operationalize? And for me, that's not just only the issue of initial adoption, but whether or not you can design institutions that are effective, that can adapt, that allow you to survive through difficult times and uncertainties, transition beyond leadership changes. And clearly in the European case, that has been problematic and has done a lot of damage. The European case has invoked a lot. It's also emerged in some places within Asia. I wouldn't say necessarily that the tables have turned and this is the moment for carbon taxation. I think we're seeing in the case of the Canadian process, where the federal government is saying a pan-Canadian price, each province, you have to decide which one you're going to pursue. I'm not sure that's necessarily going to hold together. We might talk a little bit more about that today. But there you see some provinces either going with the carbon tax that they've adopted initially or revisiting it, others pursuing cap and trade, possibly in collaboration. But the debate is on, but I do think that this poses particular challenges because it further splinters a coalition, a potential coalition that might come together along these lines. And whenever you have fundamental divides in the policy tool that you choose, not just in climate policy, you have a hard time putting together that first coalition. And then when inevitably there are bumps and challenges in implementation, holding that coalition together over time.
This gentleman up here, and then we'll come back to you in the striped shirt.
Thanks. Dave Grossman, Greenlight Consulting. So I've got one comment and then 2 quick questions. One of the questions won't surprise you, but I'm still interested in your thoughts on it. So the quick comment is another parallel between tobacco and the fossil fuel case would be litigation as a tool. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that to an extent. But some of the public nuisance, conspiracy, masking science for profit, all those things are starting to play now. The tobacco litigation strategies are starting to reemerge again as climate litigation strategies. So I think that could be another driver that is a similarity between the two. My two questions, one, which will not surprise you, is given the research that we've talked about before, the use of carbon price revenues and how that affects political viability. You've mentioned a couple cases very quickly about how it has hurt, because there's a food fight over where the revenues go, and then that leads to a stalemate. But presumably, the revenues can also be used in ways that advance political viability, whether offsetting the regressive effects on low-income populations or being used to accelerate reduction trajectories, as some of my research has worked on. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on how the revenue use can help and or hurt the political viability. And then my second question also ties to the cap versus tax area, but in terms of the actual price level. So there's been research showing that most carbon prices around the world are nowhere near the social cost of carbon or the actual externality. They're often very low. And a lot of those, what we've seen often in the talk about carbon taxes is they should be $40 a ton or higher. And what you see looking at a lot of the cap systems we have in this country, at least, is you have allowances trading for $2, $3 a ton. But these are caps that are theoretically, 80% by 2050, or theoretically enough. So there's some interesting price disparities between what we say we need from a tax or a cap, what is actually being implemented around the world in terms of a tax or a cap, and then also disparities between taxes and caps. In capped systems, it seems like allowances are trading way cheap compared to where we keep saying tax levels ought to be.
Or where those things intersect with political
So I'd be
viability.
curious on your thoughts on those.
Barry.
Sure. First on the tobacco, you're quite right. There are these other analogies or parallels that are being raised. One that I neglected to mention in the University of Michigan case was not litigation, but considering divestiture of investment in oil companies, gas companies, coal. So it does get played out. How rigorous that comparison is, even in the tax case, I'm not sure, but I do think it is intriguing, the frequency with which this idea becomes recycled, and you look to the playbook and decide where you might go. Absolutely. On the revenue issue, I do think that this becomes a challenging question and an interesting one. And the idea of the carbon pricing sort of fits into this issue of climate change, which is challenging and is truly a kind of a wicked problem, because in effect what you're asking people to do is take a product that they're familiar with. Certainly when you turn to gasoline, everyone knows what that price is, and allow government to increase that price, those prices. Cost, clear, vivid, hard to hide, with the idea that there's going to be a benefit from that, possibly in future generations through climate mitigation or abatement, but it's going to be really hard to scale that and measure that in a credible way to the local level. I often ask my students, how many times in your life, and this is students from the US but beyond, how many times has the leader of your nation asked you to make an immediate sacrifice of something so that there might be a longer term benefit? And most students don't have a reaction. They've never been asked. Politically, how well does it play in Canada, the US, or anywhere else to do this? So you're right. One way you can begin to mitigate that cost, although probably not offset the pain that the cost imposes or is perceived to cause, is through revenue allocation. And an interesting question, not unique to this area. I also studied the experience of the interstate highway system legislation in the 1950s, where there had been years and years and decades of debate. Everyone knew what the benefit would be in an interstate highway system, but the issue was how to pay for it, ultimately deciding a tax and then a linkage. So I do conclude there are real possibilities by thinking clearly and systematically and being credible and transparent about the revenue allocation process that you will pursue. I do think that there's a great risk in leaving that to a later time period and just simply say there is a pot, we can continue to fight over it, but to come forward with a story and a message that's credible. Now, that may differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In some cases, some kind of revenue neutrality, reducing taxes dollar for dollar, like British Columbia, might make sense. Maybe a dividend works politically in some jurisdictions where everybody gets a rebate, sort of like the Alaska oil revenue return. In other cases, other expenditures or even linking it to next generation or alternative energy might come into play. When we've done surveys on this, and we've done actually now quite a few, the pattern is pretty clear. However you raise a carbon pricing question, usually you have a very hard time getting anything approaching a majority level of support, unless perhaps it's at a very, very low level. Even that doesn't guarantee it. Obviously, you can't win with that strategy in political terms. What about putting the money into deficit reduction? Certainly in the US, Americans are concerned about deficits at the state and local level. It doesn't help. Within some constituencies, particularly Democrats, it really waters down support. The two net winners are revenue neutrality and some kind of tax reduction, or transition to next generation energy. But usually when we look at this, the biggest bump up is in the latter case. Taking the price revenue and putting it into energy efficiency, alternative energy, the costs of renewables, somehow in the public imagination in ways that we really didn't anticipate when we started doing this survey work, and asked this experiment in a number of ways, that tends to get a somewhat greater base of support than anyone else. Now, I don't think you can look at those numbers and be overly sanguine about what that means or how well that coalition will hold together. And with that does come the peril. Look at the state of Washington, where you've now had a ballot position for a carbon tax that was resoundingly defeated because constituencies that might well have been thought to support a carbon tax engaged in civil war. We have just gone through the experience in the Washington legislature with a governor who is all in for a carbon tax, could not move that through in a state that doesn't produce fossil fuels. And that on the heels of 10 years of efforts by Democratic predecessors of current Governor Inslee to put some kind of a cap and trade package together with some provinces and some states. And in each case, looking differently at what the revenue tumblers might look like. So the point is not that there's a wink, wink, here's all you have to do. But I do think there is this question of being clear about what it's going to be. But then this issue of transition, and I think this is one area where I really try to emphasize in the book, hopefully with some success. You cannot just play for the current game and try to figure out how you can get a legislature or some parliamentary body to screw up the political courage to do this short term and then assume the problem goes away and it moves on permanently. How do you build a larger and broader coalition? One last point on this, is we've done some surveys on this and others have, even in jurisdictions where that revenue is being reallocated and returned, it's not as if people are paying lots and lots of attention to this, but the overall credibility and understanding of that message is really important. And we've seen a near infinite number of ways where you can really mess this up, fragment your coalition, and then lead not just to initial adoption, but substantial reversal, in some cases a matter of months rather than years, which doesn't work.
Part two, Barry, was beyond cap or tax, whatever the mechanism, underpricing it.
Right. And here I think is a somewhat unintended consequence as we move deeper into this arena. Part of that, I think, reflects the fact that the ease, the complexity of moving carbon pricing forward initially was dramatically underestimated, and there was never an expectation that you would have years or decades of development of an infrastructure of other policies, regulatory mandates, performance standards, other kinds of things. These are in place in a great many jurisdictions, including those that have carbon pricing, and so there's already this question of competition and how much of the actual reduction is being achieved by the cap or the cap and trade as opposed to a renewable energy mandate or a wide range of other things. And so this sort of commingling of the policies really becomes challenging. It's hard to measure. And as we've talked before, the idea then of even merging these tools in other ways becomes challenging because clearly no jurisdiction that has adopted a renewable energy mandate or whatever the equivalent is then going to repeal that. The carbon pricing tool that is ultimately picked is going to have to coexist with that. You might then have very low prices under an auctioning system for cap and trade. And you might really be then raising questions about just how significant is this price as a secondary or a supplemental tool rather than the original plan, which was that it would be the central mechanism, the central driving force. And again, the politics of making that change in a dramatic way is tough just about anywhere.
I meant to say this before I turn to your questions, and with no criticism of the people who've asked questions, but we're going to eliminate multi-part questions. Or, in addition to carbon pricing, we're going to have a question pricing. The first one is free, And then we're going to charge for the second one, just to get to as many of you as possible.
And no
And,
trading.
That's right, and no trading. The woman in the striped shirt is next, right next to you. There you go. That's right. You're grandfathered in. No charge.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Sarah Duffy from Georgetown Climate Center, also a former student. So my question is
You
about
have a
the-
loyal cadre of former students, Sarah Barry. It's good to see.
So I had a question about the role of private sector actors in kind of creating the politics. Just recently, I've had at a couple events and things like that run into this Climate Leadership Council organization that has brought together a lot of CEOs, including from oil and gas companies, to kind of coalesce around an idea of a carbon tax that in some ways is actually pretty ambitious, starts at $40, increases by like 3 to 5% each year, but also includes, it's, revenue neutral, so it's a dividend, but it also includes a requirement that regulations be simplified, which I'm assuming means take away the authority to regulate carbon under the Clean Air Act. And this kind of, I guess I'm just wondering whether these kind of side groups and statements from private sector companies about we're all about dealing with climate change, but we must do it through a market-based system like a carbon tax is just a red herring, because then we saw in Washington there was a carbon tax proposed and the Washington Business Association came against it. I didn't see Exxon stepping up and in support of it. So I guess I'm just wondering whether this kind of hope of some kind of common ground with more market-based or economically liberal constituencies is real, or I guess I just wanted your take on whether that's feasible and whether the trade in the policies is worth it.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. If there's ever a moment for corporate leaders to speak in a clear and resolute way about their feelings on this issue and willingness to support policy, this is the time. And I find the signals that begin to emerge are confusing, because for a long time now, 2009, but well before that, we've heard corporations say, we do an internal carbon price. In theory, in principle, we support that. But as I've watched this, especially at the state level, looking not just at carbon pricing issues, but energy extraction taxes, severance taxes, the actual engagement in some cases of those firms in the process isn't quite as clear. And so I think that role really does become important to begin to sort out. And as we've begun to see around the world where carbon prices have been adopted, certainly Europe, but other places as well. And this is true of many of the newer carbon prices adopted in the last 2 or 3 years. They are loaded with exemptions. They are loaded with alternatives. They are not a clean, reasonable folks can get together on what a carbon pricing bill would look like, and it can be relatively short. We've seen a few instances of that, but for the most part, these begin to look like arms treaties or trade agreements. They get more complicated and complicated all the time. That's because of a whole bunch of factors. But usually, as I've watched it, firms that in broad terms will say, great, carbon price, terrific. They'll pay for a full-page ad in the Washington Post or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. But then when it comes time to negotiate it, there is this piece. And so when one looks at the CLC proposal or others, I think this does become an interesting issue. And it's part of the question of how much of this conversation takes place in quiet rooms where you take away the politics, then what happens when you do go public. And I think that's a challenge. I would only add that I don't think it's just one for the United States. I think we're seeing this play out in Canada. I think we're seeing this play out in Mexico. But most other places that are thinking about some variation and some version of this. And I do think that this is an amazing moment for firms that clearly have a strong vested interest in this. If you want to move toward what all the economists would argue is the way to go, as opposed to ever adding complexity through regulation, this is a moment to think about that. But we'll see.
Okay, we've got a gentleman right here, and then we'll come to you, sir.
Hi, Ben Proctor with the Canada Institute. Following up exactly on that, how do regulations poll for the public? So these are probably at the bottom of the list. I mean, depending on which mechanism they use, but economists don't like regulatory approaches, performance standards to reduce carbon emissions. How does that play out in the public polling you've done?
Thanks, Ben. I make the argument in the book that economic desirability and political feasibility are kind of loggerheads on this issue, but also a great many others. And so there are two ways to test this empirically. One is to look at what governments actually do and then what they sustain over time. And there the argument is pretty clear in North America, but beyond, but regulatory approaches and strategies are much more likely to be adopted than a carbon price and to prove durable and to endure. But it also plays out in the arena of public opinion. Whenever you look at certainly our survey data, but others, but look at fuel economy standards or tailpipe emission standards or any way you might want to define a regulatory kind of instrument, these tend to poll very well. They tend to poll pretty well across different partisan groups that might otherwise not come into agreement. And think about, especially given all the recent controversy, the issue of the merger of tailpipe emissions and vehicle fuel economy standards in the Trump administration potentially reversing some Obama-era issues proposed. We know what happens in that case is that cost is added to the purchase price of a vehicle. The technologies are required. You have to meet your fuel economy standards. When I was in Washington, D.C. for the year, I didn't need to drive. I got back to Ann Arbor. Guess what? I needed a car. So I made a pest of myself trying to find out what the new car price I was going to pay for, what the vehicle abatement, the emission abatement equipment was. And I was told no one's ever asked that question. We don't know. And actually even the academic literature is in debate over this. And so in that case, politically, I think this works because people don't know what the cost is or what the costs are. Same of renewable energy mandates. You're probably paying more every month, but you just don't see that for the most part as a piece of it. And it contributes to a much broader area of support. I actually think more broadly in policy, this is one of the reasons why market-based strategies often run into certain challenges or problems, because there are alternatives. And just as we found at the university, there are ways to move this forward that can't make good sense from an economics perspective, but as I flip it, probably makes sense from a political perspective.
Thanks. Right, this gentleman right here at the table. Yes. Just wait, no, the microphone behind you. I was just trying to direct the mic to you.
Thank you. I'm Chris Hill, retired from the faculty at the Schar School of Public Policy and Government at George Mason. Long interested in this subject, 40 years actually or more, and no progress so far, but we're hoping. Let me just observe, I liked your last comment about the hidden prices associated with regulation, which I think are, in political terms, a strong virtue. But I wanted to go back to just one question back, to the consideration of cap and trade versus a direct tax mechanism and the susceptibility of those in political terms to special pleading manipulation, which shows up then in the kind of incredible complexity that was the end stage of the failed cap and trade bill in Congress in 2009 or so. That bill just got more and more elaborate and less likely as the conversation went ahead. That cap and trade bill. Is that inevitable also if they were to if Congress were to look at a serious tax bill, it would simply be full of loopholes and special provisions for nursing homes and old folks and rural areas and yada, yada, yada? Or is there, in your view, politically more susceptibility of one than the other to that kind of fine-tuning on behalf of constituencies?
I wish I could say that there's an easy path forward with one rather than the other. But I think given the realities of the political process in the U.S. and beyond, both run significant risks. That said, clearly we have seen, particularly in the case of cap and trade, the way loopholes, exemptions through generous provision of offsets, flexibility mechanisms, and all the rest can be added and just really water down the beast. I mean, going back to 2009, if you think of the legislation that reached the floor of the House of Representatives, having just said that we passed an interstate highway system that was 40 pages or so, I believe that bill that was voted on, Waxman-Markey, was over 1,400 pages. And if memory serves, 300 pages were added in the 24 hours before the bill was voted upon. That passed narrowly with a small number of Republican crossovers, a lot of Democratic defections, and of course we all know what happened when it moved to the Senate. But under what circumstances might it have been possible to ever reconcile that and bring that together in a significant way? Not just to get some piece of legislative sausage done, but in a way that would have been more consistent with the principles that you're talking about, or most academic supporters of a carbon price would suggest. That's tough. Again, not just this area. Think of the exercise we've been through in the last year in tax reform in the US and compare that to the experience of the 1986 Tax Reform Act, which, kind of like the SO2 experience, gets studied over and over and over again because it was this one grand bargain moment that worked, but required a very unique coming together of constituencies to allow for a simplification of the tax system given the inevitable pressures to add complexity to it. And yet, the history, of course, of the 1986 Tax Reform Act was it was adopted, it was this remarkable coalition, but almost immediately upon implementation, those constituencies that had lost went back to the table and gradually were able to add so much of that into play. So I think it's tough to do under any circumstances in a political system. My own personal sense, having watched this, is that it's more difficult to get a cleaner version of legislation through if it's cap and trade versus a carbon tax. And one other piece to think about here is just simply implementation. Generally, when we see a carbon tax bill, empirically, we're talking about a matter of months from adoption to launching the policy. In the case of cap and trade, we are often talking about years and major mid-course adjustments. And so you have to have mechanisms in place for cap and trade to allow for revisitation, looking at how the world and circumstances changed. That means then dialing back and thinking about major shifts and changes that you might not need in a tax system. So there are those forces and factors that come into this too.
Barry, we are down to our final minutes, and if you could take maybe two of those to answer this question, sort of a forward, the trend line question, things you see happening. And particularly in the book, you mentioned the potential for a carbon pricing collaboration between the U.S. and Canada. I don't know if that's serious enough to reach the level of trend line that you would identify. I'll leave that to you. But what do you see moving forward? And if that is part of the mix, what might that look like?
Sure. A couple of things. One is, while I've been pretty pessimistic on the whole, I also spend a lot of time in the book on what I would call more successful cases and success stories. When we get it right in public policy, not in a perfect way, but do a lot better than we might expect, what do we learn from those cases? How did British Columbia do this 11 years ago? How did the states of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative do this, hold it together despite substantial leadership changes? How did Ireland, in the middle of a crisis in 2010, move dramatically toward a series of environmental taxes, including a carbon tax? Norway becomes a really interesting case for lots and lots of reasons, including how they tax the production of oil and gas. So there are interesting cases and stories that I think one can build upon. It doesn't create the level of generalizability or easy models to look at, but there are those issues that are interesting to think about, and I at least try to pull those out. On the case of Canada and the U.S., in theory, this is a case where, given the long-standing history of cooperation between these two countries, where lots of money and people and electrons move north-south, Canada for a long time has had a vested interest in getting its large renewable energy sources, particularly hydro, into American markets in the north, or excuse me, in the east, in the central parts of the country, and in the west. We have seen great historical collaboration on a range of environmental issues, including water. But when it comes to energy, even before you get to climate, this has proven challenging for both countries to get into alignment with about the same policy goals at about the same time. And so then you have this friction and conflict. Canada struggled mightily with this, and in many respects has had a harder time meeting some of its early pledges and reduction targets than the U.S. That's no secret. It's an empirical reality that we've seen over time. There was some hope in past years that it might be possible to better reconcile. I think the Trudeau pan-Canadian framework is an intriguing one, particularly because it is such a decentralized strategy. You set a national goal and standard, allow individual provinces to set up their mechanisms, but then allow that each province to keep their revenue and decide how that's going to be used. But I wouldn't be surprised, given the fact that given some of the shifts in the U.S. and there's no immediate move to match that with any kind of a carbon price anytime soon, does that in effect create an excuse for Canada to move away from that because the U.S. is too big a market and cannot maintain that? And with it, energy policy in the U.S. and Canada becomes a patchwork quilt of subsidies, regulations, incentives, and efforts by each state and each province to kind of draw a boundary around itself to maximize its own perceived self-benefit as opposed to looking at some of the options. I think this is a huge issue and challenge. And I think in the Mexican case, we also see some really, really interesting questions about their willingness to move beyond some of the major shifts that have occurred there on energy broadly defined, especially consumer subsidies, but even the launch of a new carbon price. So to expand beyond the 49th parallel, I think this is a big, big challenge on the North American side over the next few years.
Barry, thank you. I want to thank all of you who joined us in person and those of you who joined us via the webcast. And stay in touch with us. WilsonCenter.org is one way to do that. If you go to the research tab, you can find the Canada Institute and all kinds of other regional and topic-specific areas that the Wilson Center covers. Thanks again for joining us, and please join me in thanking our guest and the author of the book, Barry Rabe. Barry, thank you. Books available outside this store, mere steps away, if you'd like to have Barry sign one for you. Thanks again.